Please close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the faint, rhythmic ticking of the old mechanical clock on the wall and the heavy, earthy smell of damp tatami mats during the rainy season. Can you hear the distant, melancholic wail of the sweet potato vendor echoing through the dark, quiet streets of your old neighborhood? Welcome back, my old friend. Today, we are going to take a long, slow walk down memory lane. We are going to revisit 25 incredibly cheap, simple foods we ate back in the 1970s and 1980s, when our pockets were empty, but our hearts were so very full. Life was entirely different back then. We did not have 24-hour convenience stores on every corner, and fast food was a rare, unimaginable luxury. Instead, our mothers performed daily miracles in tiny, cramped kitchens, turning the most basic ingredients into meals that we still dream about today. I promise you, by the time we reach the end of our journey and remember that sweet, warm treasure we shared on freezing winter nights, you will feel the warmth of those golden days flooding right back into your soul. Before we sit down to eat, let us remember how time used to flow in those days. In the Showa era, time moved at a much slower, gentler pace. There was no rushing, no instant gratification. We learned the true value of patience. We sat shoulder to shoulder around the low, round, wooden chabudai table, our knees practically touching, waiting for the heavy iron pot on the stove to finish steaming the rice. Some people today might look back at our old lives and think we were poor. They see our lack of modern technology, our patched clothes, and our incredibly simple meals, and they feel pity. But they are completely wrong. We were not poor in the ways that truly mattered. Our lives were deeply rich in human connection, in genuine gratitude, and in the sheer joy of small blessings. Every single grain of rice was treated with absolute respect. A tiny splash of soy sauce or a single drop of precious oil was a reason to celebrate. We did not stare at glowing screens while we ate. We looked at each other. We talked. We laughed. And we shared everything we had. The meals we are about to remember were born out of strict necessity and tight budgets, yes. But they were seasoned with a profound, irreplaceable motherly love that transformed the humblest scraps into a feast fit for an emperor. Let us begin our journey with the humble, beloved bowl of butter rice, known to so many of us simply as butter meshi. Imagine a chilly evening in the 1970s, sitting on the tatami mat in your small living room. The heavy iron pot on the stove finally clicks, signaling that the short-grain white rice is perfectly steamed. Your mother scoops a generous mound into a ceramic bowl, the surface of the rice shining like tiny pearls in the dim light. Because meat was a rare luxury, you had to find richness elsewhere. You would take a small, precious pat of yellow butter and bury it deep inside the steaming mountain of rice. You waited patiently for exactly 1 minute, feeling the warmth of the bowl against your palms. Then, you would pull the rice apart to reveal a molten, golden pool. A slow, careful drizzle of dark, salty soy sauce over the top completed the ritual. The moment the cold soy sauce hit the melted fat, a savory, intoxicating aroma filled the tiny kitchen. Mixing it all together created a creamy, decadent meal out of almost nothing. The salty, rich flavors coated every single grain. It was a dish born of necessity, yet it felt like a feast. Every time you lift a bowl of plain rice today, you might still catch a ghost of that buttery scent, transporting you back to a time when a single scoop of fat was the greatest treasure a child could ask for. Now, let us turn our memories to another unforgettable bowl of comfort, affectionately known as neko mama, or cat rice. If you grew up in a traditional Japanese household during the 1970s, you surely remember the large, wooden block of dried skipjack tuna sitting in the kitchen. It was as hard as a piece of mahogany wood. Your mother would take a special wooden box with a sharp blade on top, carefully gripping the block of fish. The rhythmic, scraping sound of shaving the bonito echoed through the house, signaling that a meal was ready. We did not have money for expensive meat, but a handful of these freshly shaved, papery flakes was all we needed. You would pile a fluffy mountain of steaming hot white rice into your ceramic bowl, then gently lay the translucent bonito flakes over the top. Because the rice was so hot, the thin flakes would immediately begin to curl and twist, dancing as if they were alive. It was a magical sight for a hungry child. We would pour a slow, deliberate splash of soy sauce over the dancing flakes, watching the dark liquid soak into the white grains below. The savory, oceanic smell would rise with the steam, filling the room with warmth. We called it cat food because it was so simple and cheap, but to us, seated around the low chabudai table, it tasted like an absolute luxury. It was a testament to how a single, humble ingredient could transform plain rice. And speaking of simple rice dishes, how could we ever forget the golden perfection of tamago kake gohan, raw egg on rice? In those days, a fresh egg was treated with profound respect. It was not something you ate carelessly. You would crack the delicate shell on the edge of the table, letting the bright orange yolk and clear white slip into a tiny side bowl. The ritual was always the same. You added exactly 1 drop of soy sauce, and then the secret ingredient, a tiny sprinkle of Ajinomoto, that magical white powder that made everything taste incredible. The sound of your wooden chopsticks rapidly beating the egg against the side of the ceramic bowl created a cheerful, clinking music that meant breakfast was ready. You would use your chopsticks to dig a small, shallow well in the center of your hot rice, pouring the golden liquid right into the middle. Vigorously stirring it all together, the heat of the rice would slightly cook the egg, creating a thick, velvety, and incredibly savory porridge. It slipped down your throat so easily, providing just enough energy for a long day of playing outside or walking to school. Even today, with all the gourmet food available in the world, there are times when only the comforting, slippery warmth of tamago kake gohan can truly soothe an aching, nostalgic heart. Let us also remember the absolute joy of a sweet treat made from pure scraps. The unforgettable fried bread crusts, or pan no mimi. Bread was becoming more popular in Japan during the 1960s and 70s, but the soft white center was usually reserved for proper sandwiches. The tough outer crusts were often cut off and thrown away, but our mothers and the kind owners of the local neighborhood bakeries knew better than to waste food. We would run to the bakery clutching a small cloth bag, and the baker would fill it to the brim with discarded bread crusts for just a few copper coins, or sometimes even for free. Back in our cramped kitchen, your mother would heat up a small amount of cheap cooking oil in a heavy frying pan. She tossed the long strips of bread crust into the bubbling oil until they turned a beautiful, deep golden brown and became incredibly crisp. While they were still piping hot and glistening with oil, she would toss them in a paper bag filled with cheap white sugar. The crunch when you bit into one was deafening. The coarse sugar melted instantly on your tongue, followed by the rich, oily crunch of the fried bread. We ate them like candy, getting our fingers greasy and completely covered in sticky sugar. It was a perfect, beautiful dessert, made entirely out of something the rest of the world considered garbage. Now, let us bring our minds back to the comforting smell of yaki onigiri, the grilled rice ball. In an era before microwave ovens existed in every home, you could not simply press a button to reheat yesterday's dinner. The leftover white rice from the night before would sit in the wooden tub, turning cold, hard, and thoroughly unappetizing. But our mothers possessed the magic to bring it back to life. She would wet her hands with slightly salted water and press the tough, cold rice together, forming tight, dense triangles. Then came the beautiful part. She would place a small wire mesh directly over the open blue flame of the gas stove. She laid the rice balls carefully on the mesh, brushing them repeatedly with a thick layer of dark soy sauce. As the fire licked the bottom of the rice, the soy sauce began to scorch and caramelize. The intense, smoky, deeply savory aroma of burning soy sauce would instantly fill the entire house, making your stomach rumble violently. The outside of the rice bowl transformed into a dark, crunchy, chewy crust, while the inside finally became soft and warm again. Biting through that incredibly hard, salty exterior to reach the comforting white rice inside was a textural masterpiece. We ate them as after-school snacks, holding the hot, sticky triangles carefully in our bare hands, savoring every burnt, flavorful crumb. Let us journey to the bitter, freezing winters of the Showa era and remember the heavy, life-saving warmth of Suton soup. Our old wooden houses were incredibly drafty, and the cold wind would seep right through the thin paper sliding doors. Meat was far too expensive for a regular weekday meal, but hungry bellies needed to be filled. Suton was the ultimate food of survival and love. Your mother would take a simple bowl of flour and add just enough water to make a sticky, lumpy dough. She would boil a large pot of water, flavoring it with cheap soy sauce, a few scraps of daikon radish, and maybe some leftover green onion tops. Then, using her fingers or 2 small spoons, she would tear off irregular, sticky lumps of the flour dough and drop them directly into the rolling dark broth. The lumps would swell up, absorbing the salty liquid. They were not elegant or refined. They were heavy, dense, and incredibly chewy dumplings. But when you sat shivering at the table, clutching the hot ceramic bowl with both hands to warm your freezing fingers, that soup was a miracle. The dense flour dumplings sat heavily in your stomach, chasing away the gnawing hunger and providing a deep, lasting warmth that stayed with you all through the long, dark winter night. It was the purest taste of a mother's fierce determination to keep her children fed and warm. And what about that bright, unmistakable flash of color in our lunchboxes? The famous gioniku soseji, or fish sausage. Real pork sausages were an imported, expensive luxury that we could rarely afford. Instead, we had these brilliant, almost unnaturally pink cylinders made from cheap, processed white fish paste. They were tightly sealed in a crinkly plastic wrapping, always fastened at both ends with incredibly tough little metal clips. Completing them was a childhood skill we all had to master, usually by using our teeth to tear the plastic just below the metal ring, peeling it back like a strange, pink banana. Sometimes, we were so hungry we ate them completely raw, walking home from the local shop, savoring the salty, slightly rubbery texture. But the true magic happened when they were sliced into small diagonal coins and fried in a pan. The heat caused the edges of the pink sausage to curl up into little cups, and the flat sides turned a delicious, crispy golden brown. Your mother would tuck these fried pink medallions into the corner of your aluminum bento box, nestling them right next to the white rice. They provided a burst of salty, savory flavor that made the plain rice taste extraordinary. Even today, seeing that bright pink plastic wrapper in a supermarket instantly brings back the specific, metallic smell of those little metal clips. We must also take a moment to visit the dusty, magical aisles of the neighborhood Dagashiya, the beloved penny candy store, to remember Fugashi. In the 1970s, with only a few heavy, bronze 10-yen coins clinking in your pocket, the Dagashiya was a paradise. The shop was always run by an ancient, hunchbacked woman sitting silently behind a tiny wooden counter. Among all the cheap, colorful sweets, the long, dark brown sticks of fugashi were a staple. They were made from wheat gluten, baked until they were incredibly light and airy, and then heavily coated in a thick layer of cheap, dark brown molasses syrup. They felt as light as a feather in your hand, almost as if you were holding nothing at all. But when you took a bite, the brittle, sugary shell would crack loudly, and the dry, airy gluten inside would instantly melt on your tongue. The flavor was a deep, slightly bitter and intensely earthy sweetness that coated your teeth and made your fingers incredibly sticky. We would sit on the concrete steps outside the shop, the afternoon sun casting long shadows, slowly nibbling on our giant fugashi sticks to make them last as long as humanly possible. It was a cheap, wonderful escape into sweetness for children who rarely saw fancy cakes or expensive chocolates. Let us think back to the early mornings and the absolute rule of the Showa-era kitchen. Nothing was ever wasted. This brings us to the humble but powerful daikon leaf miso soup. When your mother bought a massive, heavy white daikon radish, the thick, prickly green leaves at the top were never thrown into the garbage. They were precious ingredients. Before the sun even fully rose, you could hear the rhythmic, rapid thumping of her heavy kitchen knife hitting the wooden cutting board, finally chopping those rough green leaves. She would drop them into the bubbling pot of dashi and miso paste. The tough leaves would soften, turning a dark, muddy green, releasing a distinctly earthy, slightly bitter flavor into the salty miso broth. Waking up to the smell of that earthy, rich soup was the defining start to a 1970s morning. You would sit at the chabudai in your pajamas, slurping the hot liquid. The slightly bitter crunch of the daikon leaves was perfectly balanced by the deep, fermented saltiness of the miso paste. It was not a glamorous dish, and no restaurant would ever dare to serve it, but it taught us a profound lesson. It taught us to respect every single part of the food we were given, and to find true, hearty flavor in the things that others would simply throw away. And speaking of making something out of nothing, let us remember the magical, transparent wonder of katakuriko mochi, the potato starch jelly. There were many long afternoons when the craving for a sweet dessert was completely overwhelming, but the cupboards were bare. That is when your mother would perform a special kind of kitchen alchemy. She would take a few spoonfuls of plain white potato starch, the kind normally used for thickening savory sauces, and place it in a small bowl. She would add a pinch of sugar, and then, the crucial step, she would pour boiling hot water directly over the fine white powder. You would watch in absolute awe as she rapidly stirred the mixture with a spoon. Right before your eyes, the opaque white liquid would suddenly seize, transforming into a thick, sticky, translucent, jelly-like mass. It was hot, stretchy, and gooey. You would carefully scoop a small amount onto your spoon, blowing on it frantically to cool it down before placing it in your mouth. The texture was incredibly chewy, just like real mochi, but it melted away into a gentle, sweet warmth. It was a dessert made from exactly 3 ingredients: water, starch, and sugar. Yet, to a child with absolutely no alternatives, it felt like a miraculous, comforting gift from a loving mother. Let us turn to a dish that perfectly captures the spirit of making do, the brilliant illusion of fake sukiyaki made with dried fu. Real beef sukiyaki was a dish reserved strictly for New Year's Eve, or an incredibly special celebration. The rich, marbled meat was far beyond the reach of a normal working family's weekly budget. But we still craved that sweet, salty, deeply savory flavor of the dark soy broth. So, our mothers improvised beautifully. She would take dry, brittle discs of wheat gluten, known as fu, and soak them in a bowl of cold water until they became soft and spongy. Then, she would simmer these gluten sponges in a shallow iron pan filled with soy sauce, sugar, cheap cooking sake, and slices of long green onions. As the broth bubbled away, the porous gluten would absorb every single drop of that incredible, sweet and salty liquid. When you finally picked up a piece with your chopsticks and bit into it, the hot, flavorful broth would burst into your mouth, mimicking the rich satisfaction of eating meat. Mixed with a bowl of steaming rice, you almost forgot that there was absolutely no beef in the pot. It was a masterpiece of imagination and resourcefulness, allowing a poor family to gather around a steaming iron pot and feel like they were dining like kings. Now, we must recall the ultimate late-night comfort food. A dish so simple, yet so profoundly satisfying. Ochazuke with a single umeboshi. When the evening grew late and your stomach began to rumble with an empty ache, you did not ask for a heavy meal. You went to the kitchen and scooped a small portion of leftover, hardened white rice into a tea bowl. Right in the center, you placed a single, deeply wrinkled, fiercely red pickled plum, an umeboshi. These plums were often homemade, dried in the late summer sun by a grandmother, and they were intensely, almost painfully sour and salty. You would take the heavy cast iron kettle and pour boiling hot green tea directly over the rice and the plum. The heat of the tea instantly softened the tough rice grains, and the sour, red juice of the plum began to slowly bleed into the green liquid. You held the warm bowl close to your face, feeling the steam warm your nose. The ritual was to eat it quickly, slurping the hot, savory, bitter, and overwhelmingly sour mixture loudly. The sharp bite of the umeboshi cut through the mildness of the rice and tea, jolting your senses and settling your stomach perfectly. It was the purest, most comforting end to a long, exhausting day, preparing you for a deep, peaceful sleep. Let us also bring to mind the incredible stretching power of the humble canned mackerel, the legendary Saba-kan. Meat was expensive, but a small tin of mackerel, preserved in water or cheap brine, was something most families could just barely afford. But one tiny can of fish was not enough to feed a hungry family of 5. This is where the magic of the Showa mother shone brightest. She would take 2 or 3 large, cheap yellow onions and slice them paper thin. She piled the massive mountain of onions into a deep frying pan, and then emptied the single can of mackerel right on top, making sure to include every single drop of the oily liquid from the tin. She simmered it all together with a heavy pour of sweet soy sauce. The onions cooked down, becoming incredibly soft, sweet, and completely infused with the rich, oily, oceanic flavor of the mackerel. The strong, fishy smell was masked by the sweetness of the onions and the dark soy sauce. Poured over a giant bowl of cheap white rice, the thick, savory sauce soaked all the way to the bottom of the bowl. We eagerly ate the sweet, fishy onions, completely satisfied, never realizing that we had only eaten a fraction of a single fish. It was a brilliant, delicious trick of survival. We cannot forget the sweltering, humid summer days of the 1970s and the desperate relief of homemade shaved ice with condensed milk. We did not have air conditioning. We only had the sluggish, rattling electric fan oscillating in the corner of the room. When the heat became unbearable, your mother would pull out the heavy, cast-iron, hand-cranked ice shaver. You watched in anticipation as she locked a solid block of ice into the machine. The heavy, grinding, scraping sound of the metal blade shaving the ice block was the absolute sound of summer. Soft, fluffy white snow would fall into the glass bowl below. We could not afford the brightly colored, fruit-flavored syrup sold at the festivals. Instead, we relied on a single, thick tin can of sweetened condensed milk. She would puncture 2 small holes in the top of the tin and pour a thick, slow, golden ribbon of the incredibly sticky, sweet milk directly over the snowy ice. The cold ice instantly caused the milk to thicken even more. You ate it quickly with a small spoon, the intense, creamy sweetness melting on your tongue, sending a sudden, freezing chill straight to your brain. It was a pure, icy salvation from the oppressive summer heat, made perfect by that simple, sticky can of milk. And what about the illicit, crunchy joy of eating raw instant ramen right out of the plastic bag? Instant noodles like chicken ramen were originally created as an affordable, quick meal, but to a child with no money for snacks, they were a crispy, salty treasure. Walking home from elementary school, you and your friends would pool your small coins to buy a single package. But you did not wait to go home and boil water. No, the ritual was completely different. You would keep the square block of dry, hard noodles inside the crinkly plastic packaging. You would smash the block with your fists, breaking the dried noodles into bite-sized chunks. If it came with a separate little silver packet of salty seasoning powder, you tore it open and dumped the powder right into the bag. Then, you pinched the top of the plastic tightly and shook it violently, coating every broken noodle in the intensely salty, artificial chicken flavor. You walked down the street, reaching into the bag and eating the dry, crunchy pieces like potato chips. The overwhelming saltiness made you incredibly thirsty, and your fingers would be completely coated in the magical, savory dust, which you would happily lick clean. It was the ultimate, slightly rebellious after-school snack. Let us return to the strict rule of wasting absolutely nothing and remember the crunchy, salty delight of watermelon rind pickles. Buying an entire, massive round watermelon was a very rare, incredibly special event, usually reserved for the middle of summer when relatives came to visit. We ate the sweet, juicy red flesh greedily, spitting the black seeds into the garden. But when the red fruit was gone, the meal was not over. The thick, pale green rind was tomorrow's side dish. Your mother would take a sharp knife and carefully peel away the tough, dark green, striped outer skin, leaving only the firm, pale white rind. She would slice it into thin strips and place them in a glass jar, covering them in a sharp mixture of cheap vinegar, dark soy sauce, and a little bit of sugar. After sitting in the refrigerator overnight, those discarded rinds transformed into something completely different. They became incredibly crunchy, intensely savory, and slightly sour pickles. We ate them alongside our morning rice, loving the loud crunch they made in our mouths. It was a beautiful lesson in finding hidden value. We took what most people considered garbage and turned it into a delicious, refreshing dish that helped stretch our meager food budget just a little bit further. We must also reflect on the ultimate cheap food, the food that was completely free, the wild mountain vegetables and dandelion greens we foraged ourselves. When spring finally arrived and the snow melted, the riverbanks and vacant lots in our neighborhoods slowly turned green. We did not go to the supermarket, we went to the river. Armed with small plastic bags, you and your siblings would search for tsukushi, the wild horsetail shoots poking up through the damp earth. You carefully snapped their thin, hollow stems. We also picked young, tender dandelion leaves. Bringing our wild harvest back to the kitchen, the real work began. Your mother had to carefully peel the bitter, tough rings off the tsukushi stalks. Because wild plants are naturally very bitter, she would boil them fiercely, changing the water multiple times. Then she simmered them in a dark, thick glaze of soy sauce and sugar, a style known as tsukudani. The intense sweetness and saltiness masked the wild bitterness of the plants. Eating those foraged greens with white rice connected us directly to the changing seasons. It was a gift from the earth itself, a free, nourishing meal that required nothing but our time, our patience, and the loving, careful hands of our mothers to prepare. Let us think about a side dish that was often promoted to the main course, the giant mound of shredded cabbage drenched in tonkatsu sauce. In a perfect world, a mountain of finely shredded, crisp white cabbage was meant to be a simple garnish, sitting next to a thick, expensive, deep-fried pork cutlet. But on most days in our houses, there was absolutely no pork cutlet to be found. The cabbage itself had to become the star of the show. Cabbage was cheap, heavy, and extremely filling. Your mother would slice it as thin as humanly possible, piling it high on a plate like a pale green mountain. To make it palatable and satisfying, we relied on a heavy bottle of dark, thick, intensely savory and fruity brown sauce, the famous tonkatsu sauce. We would completely drown the shredded cabbage in this thick black liquid. The sweet, tangy, deeply spiced flavor of the sauce soaked into the crisp leaves. We ate massive mouthfuls of it with our white rice. The crunch of the raw vegetable and the overwhelming rich flavor of the cheap sauce tricked our stomachs into feeling completely full and satisfied. It was a humble, slightly desperate meal, but that tangy, fruity sauce made it taste like a true feast. Now, let us bring our memories to the warm, wobbly, delicate comfort of a plain, poor man's chawanmushi. A traditional chawanmushi is an elegant steamed egg custard, usually filled with expensive ingredients like plump shrimp, tender chicken pieces, shiitake mushrooms, and bright green ginkgo nuts. But in our 1970s households, we stripped it down to its absolute bare essentials. Your mother would gently beat a single egg with a cup of simple dashi broth, pouring it into a heavy ceramic teacup. There was no shrimp and certainly no chicken. If you were very lucky, she might drop a single, thin slice of pink and white kamaboko fish cake into the cup before placing it in the steamer. You waited patiently, watching the steam rise until the custard set into a delicate, trembling jelly. We ate it with tiny wooden spoons. It was incredibly hot, sliding down your throat like savory silk. The rich flavor of the egg and the oceanic warmth of the dashi broth were completely soothing. It lacked all the fancy textures and expensive proteins of a restaurant dish, but sitting in our cramped, drafty living rooms, holding that hot ceramic cup in our cold hands, the delicate warmth of that simple egg custard felt like a pure, loving embrace. And finally, we arrive at the most nostalgic and deeply emotional food memory of all, the roasted sweet potato, or ishiyakimo. Close your eyes and try to remember a freezing, pitch-black winter evening in the late 1970s. You are sitting, huddled under the warm kotatsu blanket, listening to the bitter wind rattling the thin glass windows. Suddenly, from far down the quiet street, you hear the slow, melancholic wail of the sweet potato vendor. The drawn-out, haunting song echoing from the loudspeaker of his slow-moving cart is a sound that defines our entire childhood. You would beg your mother for a few coins, grab your thick coat, and run out into the freezing night air. The smell of burning wood and caramelizing sugar greeted you before you even saw the cart. The vendor would open the heavy iron lid, revealing stones radiating incredible heat, and hand you a warm, newspaper-wrapped package. Because we had very little money, you could usually only afford one small potato. You ran back inside, hands warmed by the precious treasure. Sitting under the kotatsu, you carefully snapped the charred, purple skin in half to share with your sibling. The thick, sweet steam billowed out, revealing the bright golden flesh. We were not just eating a vegetable, we were consuming the pure, shared joy of a cold winter night. Time has passed so quickly, has it not? Today we live in a world of absolute abundance. We can buy imported meats, fancy cakes, and ready-made meals 24 hours a day without ever leaving our completely climate-controlled homes. But as we look back at the butter rice, the fried bread crusts, and the shared warmth of a single roasted sweet potato, we realize a profound truth. We do not actually miss the poverty, and we certainly do not miss the gnawing feeling of an empty stomach. What we truly miss is the overwhelming feeling of togetherness. We miss the tiny, low wooden chabudai table where we sat knee to knee with our parents and siblings. We miss the intense, magical flavor that only genuine hunger and absolute gratitude can provide. Those incredibly cheap meals were seasoned with a mother's selfless love, and that is a flavor that no amount of money in the modern world can ever buy. If these memories brought a tear to your eye or a warm smile to your face, please gently press the like button and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into our shared past. And now, I want to ask you, my dear friend, what was the one cheap, humble meal from your childhood that you miss the most? Please share your precious story in the comments below. Let us keep the warmth of the Showa era alive together.